Victor called a meeting of all the laboratory staff, Markov and Sevastianov, and the two physicists, Anna Naumovna, vice papier, Nozdrin, the technician, and Perepiltsin, the electrician, and said that the doubts they had all had about the apparatus were quite unfounded. In fact, it was the accuracy of their measurements that had led to such uniform results, despite variations in the experimental conditions. Victor and Sokolov were both theoreticians. It was Markov who was in charge of the experimental work in the laboratory. He had an astonishing talent for solving difficult problems and could always unerringly determine the principles of any new piece of equipment. Victor admired the confidence with which Markov would walk up to some new apparatus and be able, after only a few minutes, and without looking at any instructions, to grasp both its essential principles and the tiniest details of its mechanism. He seemed to regard a complex apparatus as a living body. It was as though he were looking at a cat, glancing at its eyes and tail, its ears and claws, feeling its heartbeat, understanding what every part of its body was for. As for Nozdrin, the haughty technician, he really came into his own when some new apparatus was being assembled in the laboratory. Sevastianov used to joke about Nozdrin, saying, "When Stepan Stepanovich dies, his hands will be taken to the Brain Institute to be studied." Nozdrin didn't like these jokes. He tended to look down on the scientists, knowing that without his strong hands, not one of them would be able to do anything at all. The laboratory favourite was Sevastianov. He was at home in both practical and theoretical matters. Everything he did quickly and effortlessly, almost light-heartedly. Even on the gloomiest of days, his bright corn-coloured hair seemed to be full of sunlight. Victor would gaze at him admiringly, thinking that his hair reflected the brightness and clarity of his mind. Sokolov thought equally highly of him. "Yes, he's not like us Talmudists," Victor once said to Sokolov. "He's a match for you and me, and Markov put together." As for Anna Naumovna, she had an almost superhuman patience and capacity for work. Once she had spent 18 hours on end studying photographs under the microscope. Many of the other heads of department considered Victor extremely lucky to have such a brilliant staff. In answer to their comments, Victor replied jokingly, "Every head of department has the staff he deserves." "We have all been through a period of depression and anxiety," he began. "Now we can all rejoice. Professor Markov has conducted the experiments faultlessly. The credit for this, of course, also belongs to the laboratory assistants and technicians responsible for so many observations and calculations." Markov gave a little cough and said, "Oh, Victor Pavlovich, we should like you to expound your theory in as much detail as possible." Lowering his voice, he added, "I've heard that Kochkurov's research in a similar area holds out great practical possibilities. Apparently Moscow has been asking about his results." Markov usually knew all the ins and outs of everything under the sun. When the institute was being evacuated from Moscow, he had appeared in the railway carriage with all kinds of information about holds up on the line, engine changes, stops where they could get something to eat. Sevastianov, who hadn't yet shaved that morning, said thoughtfully, "I'll have a drink. To all the laboratory alcohol to celebrate." Then Anna Naumovna, who was politically very active, sighed, "Thank God for that. Party meetings, we've always been accused of all kinds of mortal sins." Nozdrin remained silent, rubbing his hand over his hollow cheeks. As for Perepiltsin, the young one-legged electrician, he just turned bright red and let his crutch fall to the floor with a bang. It had been a good day for Victor. Pimenov, the young director of the institute, had telephoned him that morning and showered him with compliments. He was about to fly to Moscow. Final preparations were underway for the return of almost the entire institute. "Victor Pavlovich," Pimenov had announced at the end of their conversations, We'll see each other in Moscow soon. I'm both proud and happy to be the director of the Institute at the time when you have brought your remarkable research to a conclusion." The meeting of the laboratory staff was equally agreeable. Markov distrusted theoreticians and liked making jokes about the running of the laboratory. He was always complaining. "We've got a brigade of doctors and professors, a battalion of research assistants, and one private soldier, Nozdrin. We're like some strange pyramid with a wide top and a mere point at its base. Very unstable. What we need is a firm foundation, a whole regiment of Nozdrins." After Victor's talk, however, he smiled and said, "Well, so much for all my talk about regiments and pyramids." As for Savostyanov, who had compared science with sport, his eyes took on a look of extraordinary warmth and joy. This was not how a football player looks at his coach, but the way a believer looks at an evangelist. Remembering Savostyanov's argument with Sokolov and his own recent conversation with him, Victor said to himself, "Well, I may understand something about the forces within the atom, but I really don't have a clue about human beings." Towards the end of the day, Anna Naumovna came into Victor's office. "Victor Pavlovich, I've just seen the list of people who are to return to Moscow. The new head of the personnel department hasn't included my name." "I know," said Victor, "but there's nothing to get upset about. There are 2 separate lists. You're on the second one. You'll be coming a few weeks later, that's all." "But for some reason, I'm the only person from our group who isn't on the first list. I've had enough of it here. I think I'm going mad. I dream of Moscow every night. And anyway, how are you going to get the laboratory set up without me?" "I know," said Victor, "but the list has already been authorized. It's very difficult to change it now. Svechin from the magnetic laboratory has already had a word about Boris Israelovich. Boris is in the same position as you, but apparently it's impossible to do anything about it now. I think the best you can do is be patient." Then he suddenly lost patience himself. "Heaven knows what's going on in their heads. They've included people we don't need at all, and for some reason they've forgotten you. You're right, we do need you to set the place up." "I haven't been forgotten," said Anna Naumovna, her eyes slowly filling with tears. "It's worse than that." She looked round quickly, almost furtively, at the half-open door. "For some reason, it's only Jewish names that have been crossed off the list. I've heard from Rimmer, the secretary of the personnel department, that almost all the Jews have been crossed off the list of the Ukrainian Academy at Ufa. The only ones left are the doctors." Victor gaped at her in momentary astonishment, then burst out laughing. "My dear woman, have you gone mad? We're not living under the Tsars, thank God. Why, this shtetl inferiority complex, it's time to forget all that." When he got home, Victor saw a familiar coat hanging on the peg. Karimov had called round. Karimov put aside his newspaper. Victor realized that Lyudmila must have avoided making conversation with him. "I've just come back from a kolkhoz," he said. "I was giving a lecture there, but please don't worry, I've been very well fed. Our people are extremely hospitable." So Lyudmila hadn't even offered him a cup of tea. It was only if Victor looked very closely at Karimov's rather crumpled face with its wide nose that he could detect any differences from the usual Slavonic mould, but at odd moments, if he turned his head in a particular way, these slight differences merged into a single pattern, changing his face into that of a Mongol. In the same way, Victor could sometimes recognize someone with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a snub nose as a Jew. The signs that revealed a man's Jewish origins were often barely perceptible: a smile, the way he furrowed his brow in surprise, even the way he shrugged his shoulders. Karimov was telling him about how he had met a wounded lieutenant who had gone back home to his village. He appeared to have come merely to tell this story. "He was a good lad," said Karimov. "He talked about everything very openly." "In Tatar?" "Oh, of course." Victor thought that if he were to meet a wounded Jewish lieutenant, He certainly wouldn't start talking to him in Yiddish. He only knew a few dozen words, and they were just pleasantries like Bekista and Halyomes. This lieutenant had been taken prisoner near Kerch in the autumn of 1941. Snow had already fallen, and the Germans had sent him to harvest the remaining wheat as fodder for horses. He had waited for the right moment, and then disappeared into the winter twilight. The local population, both Russian and Tatars, had helped him escape. "I now have real hopes of seeing my wife and daughter again," said Karimov. "Apparently the Germans have different kinds of ration cards, just as we do. And he said that many of the Crimean Tatars have fled to the mountains, even though the Germans don't harm them. When I was a student, I did some climbing in the Crimea myself," said Victor. As he spoke, he remembered that it was his mother who had sent him the money for the journey. "Did your lieutenant see any Jews?" he asked. Just then Lyudmila looked in through the door and said, "My mother still hasn't come back. I'm quite anxious." "Oh dear, I wonder what's happened to her," said Victor absent-mindedly. When Lyudmila had closed the door, he repeated his question. "What did your lieutenant have to say about the Jews?" "He said he had seen a Jewish family being taken to be shot, an old woman and 2 girls. My God. And he said he had heard of some camps in Poland especially for Jews. First they're killed, then their bodies are cut up, just like in a slaughterhouse. But I'm sure that's only a rumour. I asked him about the Jews because I knew you'd want to know." "Why just me?" Victor said to himself. "Isn't it going to interest anyone else?" Karimov thought for a moment and then said, "Oh, I forgot. He also said the Germans ordered newborn Jewish babies to be taken to the commandant's office. Their lips are then smeared with some kind of colourless preparation, and they die at once." "Newborn babies? But I'm sure it's just someone's imagination, like the camps where corpses are cut up." Victor started to pace up and down the room. "When you think about newborn babies being killed in our own lifetime," he said, "all the efforts of culture seem worthless. What have people learned from all our Goethes and Bachs? To kill babies?" "Yes," said Karimov, "it's terrible." Victor could sense Karimov's sorrow and compassion, but he was also aware of his joy. Karimov now had more hope of seeing his wife again, whereas he, Victor, knew only too well that he would never see his mother. Karimov got ready to go home. Victor didn't want to say goodbye and decided to accompany him for part of the way. "You know one thing," he said as they were putting on their coats. "Soviet scientists are very fortunate. Try and imagine the feelings of an honest German chemist or physicist who knows that his discoveries are helping Hitler. Imagine a Jewish physicist whose family are being killed off like mad dogs. Imagine what he feels when, against his will, his discovery is used to reinforce the power of fascism. He knows that, but he can't help feeling proud of his discovery. It must be terrible." "Yes," agreed Karimov, "but a thinking person can't just stop thinking." They went out onto the street. "I feel awkward about your coming with me," said Karimov. "The weather's terrible. You only just got back yourself." "It's all right," said Victor. "I'll come as far as the corner." He looked at his friend's face and said, "I enjoy walking down the street with you, even if the weather is terrible. Soon you'll be going back to Moscow. We'll have to say goodbye. You know, these meetings have meant a lot to me." "Believe me," said Victor, "I feel sad too." As Victor was on his way back, someone called out his name. Victor didn't hear it first, and then he saw Madyarov's dark eyes looking straight at him. The collar of his overcoat was turned up. "What's happening?" he asked. "Have our meetings come to an end? You've vanished off the face of the earth. Pyotr Laventrovich is angry with me." "Yes," said Victor, "it's a pity, but we did both say a lot of things in the heat of the moment." "Yes, but no one's going to pay any attention." Madyarov drew closer to Victor. His large, melancholy eyes looked even more melancholy than usual. "Still," he said, "there is one good thing about our not meeting any more." "What do you mean?" I have to tell you this, said Madjarov, almost gasping. I think old Karimov's an informer. Do you understand? You meet quite often, don't you? That's nonsense. I don't believe a word of it. Can't you see? All his friends, and all the friends of his friends, are just labour camp dust. His whole circle has vanished. He's the only one left. And what's more, he's flourishing. He's been granted his doctorate. What of it? Said Victor. I'm a doctor myself, and so are you. The same goes for us. Just think a little about our wonderful fate. You're not a child any more. Vitya, mother's only just got back. Alexandra Vladimirovna was sitting at table with a shawl round her shoulders. She moved her cup of tea closer and then pushed it away again. Guess what, she said. I spoke to someone who saw Misha just before the war. Speaking in a deliberately calm, measured tone because of her excitement, she went on to say that the neighbours of a colleague of hers had had someone to stay in their hometown. The colleague had happened to mention the name Shaposhnikova, and he had asked if Alexandra Vladimirovna had a relative called Dmitri. After work, Alexandra Vladimirovna had gone to her colleague's house. There she had learned that this man had recently been released from a labour camp. He'd been a proofreader on a newspaper and had spent 7 years in the camps for missing a misprint in a leading article. The typesetters had got one letter wrong in Stalin's name. Just before the war, he'd been transferred for an infringement of discipline from a camp in the Komi ASSR to one of the special regime lake camps in the Far East. There he had slept next to Dmitry Shapovnikov. I knew from the very first word that he really had met Mitya. He said, Mitya just lay there on the bedboards, whistling, Little bird, where have you been? Mitya came round shortly before he was arrested, and whatever I asked, he just smiled and whistled that same tune. This evening the man's going on by lorry to his family in Lyshevo. He said Mitya was ill, scurvy and heart trouble. And he said Mitya didn't believe he'd ever get out. Mitya had told him about me and Seriotsa. He had a job in the kitchen. Apparently that's the best work of all. Yes, said Victor. It's not for nothing he's got 2 degrees. You never know, said Lyudmila. This man might be a provocateur. Why should a provocateur bother with an old woman like me? All right, but there is an organisation that's interested in Victor. Lyudmila, you're talking rubbish, said Victor impatiently. But why was this man released? Asked Nadia. Did he say? The things he said are quite incredible. It seems to be a world of its own, or rather a nightmare. He was like someone from a foreign country. They've got their own customs, their own Middle Ages and modern history, their own proverbs. I asked why he'd been released. He seemed quite surprised. I was written off, he said. Don't you understand? In the end, he explained that sometimes, when they're on their last legs, goners are released. There are lots of different classes in the camps. Workers, trustees, bitches. I asked him about the 10 years without right of correspondence that thousands of people were sentenced to in 1937. He said he'd been in dozens of camps, but he hadn't met one person with that sentence. Then what's happened to all those people? I asked. I don't know, he answered, but they're not in the camps. Tree felling, deportees, people serving additional time, it just appalls me. And Bitch's lived there. He's used those same words, goners, trustees, bitches. Apparently there's a special way of committing suicide. They don't eat for several days, just drink water from the Kolyma bogs. And then they die of edema or dropsy. People just say, he was drinking water, or he began drinking. Of course, that's when they have a bad heart already. Alexandra Vladimirovna looked round at Nadia's furrowed brow and Victor's tense, gloomy face. Her head on fire and her mouth quite dry, she went on, He said that the journey's even worse than the camp itself. The common criminals have absolute power. They take away people's food and clothes. They even stake the lives of the politicals at cards. Whoever loses has to kill someone with a knife. The victim doesn't know till the last moment that his life's just been gambled away. Yes, and apparently the criminals have all the important posts in the camp. They're the ones in charge of the huts and the work gangs. The politicals have no rights at all. The criminals call them T. They even called Mitya a fascist. In a loud voice, as though she were addressing a crowd, Alexandra Vladimirovna announced, "This man was transferred from Mitya's camp to Syktyvkar. In the first year of the war, a man from Moscow called Kashkotin was appointed director of the lake camps, including Mitya's. He's been responsible for the execution of tens of thousands of prisoners." "Oh my God," said Lyudmila. "But does Stalin know of these horrors?" "Oh my God," said Nadia angrily, imitating her mother's voice. "Do you still not understand? It was Stalin who gave the order for the executions." "Nadia," shouted Victor, "cut it out!" He flew into a sudden rage, the rage of a man who senses that someone else knows his hidden weaknesses. "Don't you forget," he shouted at Nadia, "that Stalin's the commander-in-chief of the army fighting against fascism. Your grandmother trusted in Stalin to the last day of her life, and if we still live and breathe, it's because of Stalin and the Red Army. First learn to wipe your nose properly, then criticize Stalin, the man who halted the fascists at Stalingrad." "Stalin's in Moscow," said Nadia, "and you know very well who's really halted the fascists. You are peculiar. You used to come back from the Sokolovs and just say the same things yourself." Victor flew into a new surge of anger. He felt as though he'd be angry with Nadia for the rest of his life. "I never said anything of the kind. You're imagining things." "Why bring up all these horrors now?" said Lyudmila. "Soviet children are giving their lives for the motherland." It was at this moment that Nadia showed how well she understood her father's weaknesses. "No," she said, "of course you didn't. Not now. Not when your work's going so well and the German advance has been halted." "How dare you!" cried Victor. "How dare you accuse your own father of being dishonest? Lyudmila, did you hear what the girl said?" Instead of giving Victor the support he had asked for, Lyudmila just said, "I don't know why you should be so surprised. She's picked it up from you. You've said things like that to that Karimov of yours and that awful Madyarov. Maria Ivanovna's told me all about your conversations, and anyway, you've said quite enough here at home. If only we could go back to Moscow." "Enough of that," said Victor. "I know what you're about to say." Nadia was silent. Her face looked ugly and shriveled like an old woman's. She had turned away from Victor. When he finally caught her eye, she was surprised at the hatred he saw in it. The air was thick and heavy, almost unbreathable. Everything that lies half buried in almost every family, stirring up now and then only to be smoothed over by love and trust, had now come to the surface. There it had spread out to fill their lives. It was as though there were nothing between father, mother, and daughter save misunderstanding, suspiciousness, resentment, and anger. Had their common fate really engendered nothing but mistrust and alienation? "Grandmamma!" cried Nadia. Victor and Lyudmila turned simultaneously towards Alexandra Vladimirovna. She was sitting there, her head in her hands, looking as though she had an unbearable headache. There was something pitiful about this helplessness of hers. She and her grief were of no use to anyone. All she did was get in the way and stir up quarrels. All her life she'd been strong and self-disciplined. Now she was lonely and helpless. Nadia suddenly knelt down and pressed her forehead against Alexandra Vladimirovna's legs. "Grandmamma," she murmured. "Dear, kind grandmamma." Victor got up and turned on the radio. The cardboard loudspeaker moaned and wheezed. It could have been the autumn weather, the wind and snow over the front line, over the burnt villages and mass graves, over Kolyma and Vorkuta, over airfields and wet tarpaulin roofs of first aid posts. Victor looked at his wife's sombre face. He went over to Alexandra Vladimirovna, took her hands and kissed them. Then he bent down to stroke Nadia's head. To an outsider, it would seem as though nothing had changed in those few moments. The same people were in the same room, oppressed by the same grief, and led by the same destiny. Only they knew what an extraordinary warmth had suddenly filled their embittered hearts. A booming voice suddenly filled the room. During the day, our troops have engaged the enemy in the regions of Stalingrad, northeastern Tuapse and Nalchik. On the other fronts, there has been no change. Lieutenant Peter Bach was taken to hospital after receiving a bullet wound in the shoulder. The wound turned out not to be serious. The comrades who had accompanied him to the field hospital congratulated him on his luck. Even though he was still groaning with pain, Bach felt blissfully happy. Supported by an orderly, he went to take a bath. The sensation of warm water on his skin was a real pleasure. "Is that better than the trenches, then?" asked the orderly. Wanting to cheer up the lieutenant, he gestured towards the continual rumble of explosions. "By the time you're released, we'll have all that sorted out." "Have you only just been posted here?" asked Bach. "What makes you think that?" replied the orderly, rubbing the lieutenant's back with a flannel. "Well, down here no one thinks it'll be over soon. People think it will take a very long time indeed." The orderly looked at the naked lieutenant. Bach remembered that hospital personnel had instructions to report on the morale of the wounded, and he himself had just expressed a lack of confidence in the might of the armed forces. He said very distinctly, "Yes, just how it will turn out is anyone's guess." What had made him repeat these dangerous words? No one can understand unless he himself lives in a totalitarian empire. He had repeated these words because he was annoyed with himself for feeling frightened after saying them the first time, and also out of self-defense, to deceive a possible informer by a show of nonchalance. Then, to dissipate any unfortunate impression he might have produced, he said, "It's more than likely that this is the most important concentration of forces we've assembled since the beginning of the war, believe me." Disgusted at the sterility of the complex game he was playing, he took refuge in a game played by children, squeezing warm soapy water inside his clenched fist. Sometimes it squirted out against the side of the bath, sometimes straight into his face. "The principle of the flamethrower," he said to the orderly. How thin he'd become. Looking at his bare arms and chest, he thought of the young Russian woman who had kissed him 2 days before. Could he ever have imagined having an affair in Stalingrad with a Russian woman? Though it was hardly an affair, just a wartime liaison. In an extraordinary, quite fantastic setting, they'd met in a cellar. He had had to make his way past ruined buildings that were lit only by the flashes of shell bursts. It was the kind of meeting that it would be good to describe in a book. He should have seen her yesterday. She probably thought he'd been killed. Once he was better, he'd go and see her. It would be interesting to see who had taken his place. Nature abhors a vacuum. Soon after his bath, he was taken to the X-ray room. The doctor sat him down in front of the screen. "So, Lieutenant, I hear things have been tough over there," he said. "Not as tough as they've been for the Russians," Bach replied, wishing to please the doctor and be given a good diagnosis, one that would make the operation quick and painless. The surgeon came in. The 2 doctors looked at the X-rays. No doubt they could see all the poisonous dissidents that had collected inside his rib cage over the years. The surgeon took Bach's hand and began to turn it, moving it towards and away from the screen. His concern was a splinter wound. It was quite incidental that a young and highly educated man was attached to it. The doctors talked to each other in a mixture of Latin and jocular curses. Bach realised he was going to be all right. He wasn't going to lose his arm after all. "Get the lieutenant ready to be operated on," said the surgeon. "I'm going to take a look at this skull wound. It's a difficult case." The orderly removed Bach's gown, and the surgeon's assistant, a young woman, told him to sit down on the stool. "Heavens," said Bach, smiling pitifully and feeling embarrassed at his nakedness. "You should warm these stools up, Fräulein, before asking a combatant from the Battle of Stalingrad to sit down on them with a bare behind." "That's not part of our routine," she answered, in absolute seriousness. Then she began taking out a terrifying-looking array of instruments from a glass-fronted cupboard. The extraction of the splinter, however, proved quick and simple. Bach even felt a little resentful. The surgeon's contempt for this ridiculously simple operation seemed to extend to the patient. The assistant asked Bach if he needed to be accompanied back to his ward. "I'll be all right by myself." "Anyway, you won't need to stay here long," she said reassuringly. "Fine," he answered. "I was already beginning to feel bored." She smiled. Her picture of wounded soldiers was obviously derived from newspaper articles. These were full of stories about soldiers who had quietly slipped out of hospital in order to return to their beloved companies and battalions. They apparently felt an overpowering need to be fighting, otherwise life simply wasn't worth living. Maybe journalists really had found people like that in hospital. Bach, on the other hand, felt shamefully happy to lie on a bed with clean sheets, eat his plate of rice, take a puff at his strictly forbidden cigarette, and strike up a conversation with his neighbours. There were 4 men in the ward, 3 officers serving at the front, and a civil servant with a pot-belly and a hollow chest. He had been sent from the rear on a mission and had a car accident near Gumrak. When he lay on his back, his hands folded across his stomach, it looked as though someone had jokingly stuffed a football under the blanket. No doubt, this was why he had been nicknamed the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper was the only one to complain about being temporarily disabled. He spoke in an exalted tone about the duty, the army, the fatherland, and his pride at being wounded in Stalingrad. The 3 officers were amused at his brand of patriotism. One of them, Krapp, who was lying on his stomach because of a wound in the buttocks, had been in command of a detachment of scouts. He had a pale face, thick lips, and staring brown eyes. "I guess you're the kind of goalkeeper who's not content just to defend his own goal," he said, "but likes to send the ball into his opponent's net as well." Wanting to say something stinging in reply, the goalkeeper asked, "Why are you so pale? I suppose you have to work in an office." "No," said Krapp. "I'm a night bird. That's when I go hunting. Unlike you, I do my screwing during the day." Krapp was obsessed with sex. It was his chief topic of conversation. After this, everyone began cursing the bureaucrats who cleared out of Berlin every evening and drove back to their country homes, and those fine warriors, the quartermasters, who were awarded more medals than men serving in the front line. They talked about the sufferings undergone by soldiers' families when their houses were destroyed by bombs. They cursed the Casanovas in the rear who tried to make off with soldiers' wives. They cursed the military stores where you couldn't buy anything except eau de cologne and razor blades. In a bed next to Bach was a Lieutenant Garner. At first, Bach had thought he was an aristocrat, but he turned out to be a peasant, one of the men brought to the fore by the National Socialists. He had been the deputy to a regimental chief of staff and had been wounded by a bomb splinter during a night air raid. When the goalkeeper was taken away to be operated on, Lieutenant Fresser, a rather simple man who had the bed in the corner, said, "People have been shooting at me since 1939, but I've never made a song and dance about my patriotism. I get my food and drink, I get clothed, and I fight, without philosophizing about it." "Not entirely," said Bach. When frontline soldiers make fun of a man like the goalkeeper, that's already a kind of philosophy. Really? Said Gunn. How very interesting. May I ask just what kind of philosophy? Bach could tell from the hostile expression in Gerner's eyes that he was one of those people with a deep hatred of the old German intelligentsia. Bach had had his fill of speeches and articles attacking the intelligentsia for their admiration of American plutocracy, their hidden sympathies for Talmudism and Hebraic abstraction, and for the Jewish styles in literature and painting. Now he felt furious. If he was prepared to bow down before the rude strength of these new men, why then should they look at him with that wolf-like suspicion? Hadn't he been bitten by as many lice as they had? Hadn't he had frostbite? Here he was, a frontline officer, and they still didn't consider him a true German. Bach closed his eyes and turned to the wall. Why do you ask with such venom? He wanted to mutter angrily. Do you really not understand? Gerner would reply, with a smile of contemptuous superiority. No, I don't understand, he would say irritably. I told you, but perhaps I can guess. Gerner, of course, would burst out laughing. You suspect me of duplicity, he would shout. That's right, duplicity, Gerner would repeat brightly. Impotence of the will? At this point, Fresser would begin to laugh. Krapp, supporting himself on his elbows, would stare insolently at Bach. You're a band of degenerates, Bach would thunder. And you, Gerner, are halfway between a man and a monkey. Numb with hatred, Bach screwed up his eyes still tighter. You only have to write some little pamphlet on the most trivial of questions, and you think that gives you the right to despise the men who laid the foundations of German science. You only have to publish some miserable novella, and you think you can spit on the glory of German literature. You seem to imagine the arts and sciences as a kind of ministry where there's no room for you because the older generation won't make way. Where you and your little book are denied admittance by Koch, Nernst, Planck and Kellerman. No, the arts and sciences are a Mount Parnassus beneath an infinite sky. There's room there for every genuine talent that has appeared throughout human history. Yes, if there's no place for you and your sterile fruits, it's certainly not for lack of room. You can throw out Einstein, but you'll never take his place yourselves. Yes, Einstein may be a Jew, but forgive me for saying this, he's a genius. There's no power in the world that could enable you to step into his shoes. Is it really worth expending so much energy destroying people whose places must remain forever unoccupied? If your impotence has made it possible for you to follow the paths opened up by Hitler, then the fault lies with you and you alone. Police methods and hatred can never achieve anything in this realm of culture. Can't you see how profoundly Hitler and Goebbels understand this? You should learn from them. See with what love, patience and tact they themselves cherish German science, art and literature. Follow their example. Follow the path of consolidation instead of sowing discord in the midst of our common cause. After delivering this imaginary speech, Bach opened his eyes again. His neighbours were all lying quietly under their blankets. Watch this, comrades, said Fresser. With the sweeping gesture of a conjurer, he took out from under his pillow a litre bottle of 3 Knaves Italian cognac. Gerner made a strange sound in his throat. Only a true drunkard, and a peasant drunkard at that, could gaze at a bottle with quite such rapture. He's not so bad after all, thought Bach, feeling ashamed of his hysterical speech. Fresser, hopping about on one leg, filled the glasses on their bedside tables. You're a lion, said Krapp with a smile. A true soldier, said Gerner. One of the quacks spotted my bottle, said Fresser. What's that you've got wrapped in a newspaper? He asked. Letters from my mother, I answered. I carry them with me wherever I go. He raised his glass. And so, from Lieutenant Fresser, with greetings from the front. They all drank. Gerner, who immediately wanted more, said, Damn it, I suppose we'll have to leave some for the goalkeeper. "Tell with the goalkeeper," said Crabbe. "Don't you agree, Lieutenant?" "We can have a drink, and he can carry out his duty to the fatherland," said Fresser. "After all, we deserve a little fun." "My backside's really beginning to come to life," said Crabbe. "All I need now is a nice plump woman." They all felt a sense of ease and happiness. "Well," said Gurner, raising his glass, "let's have another." "It's a good thing we landed up in the same ward, isn't it?" "I thought that straight away. I came in and I thought, yeah, these are real men. They're hardened soldiers." "I must admit, I did have some doubts about Bach," said Gurner. "I thought he must be a party member." "No, I've never been a member." They began to feel hot and removed their blankets. Their talk turned to the war. Fresser had been on the left flank near Okatovka. "God knows," he said, "these Russians just don't know how to advance, but it's already November and we haven't moved forward either. Remember all the vodka we drank in August? All those toasts? Here's to our continued friendship after the war. We must found an association for veterans of Stalingrad." "They know how to launch an attack all right," said Crabbe. He himself had been in the area of the factories. "What they can't do is hold on. They drive us out of a building, and then they just lie down and go to sleep. Or else they stuff themselves while their officers get pissed." "They're savages," said Fresser with a wink, "and we've wasted more iron on these savages from Stalingrad than on the whole of Europe." "And not just iron," said Bach. "If nothing's decided by winter," said Gurner, "then it'll be a real stalemate. It's crazy." "We're preparing an offensive in the area of the factories," said Crabbe very quietly. "There's never been such a concentration of forces. Any day now they'll be unleashed. By November the 20th, we'll be sleeping with girls from Saratov." Through the curtained windows came the hum of Russian bombers and the majestic, unhurried thunder of artillery. "There go the Russian cuckoos," said Bach. "They always carry out their raids around this time. Some people call them nerve saws." "At our HQ we call them orderly sergeants," said Gurner. "Oh, quiet," said Crabbe, raising one finger. "Listen, there go the heavy guns." "While we have a little drink in the ward for the lightly wounded," said Fresser. Their carefree mood returned. They began to talk about Russian women. Everyone had some experience to recount. Bach usually disliked such conversations, but suddenly he found himself telling them about the girl who lived in the cellar of a ruined house. He made a real story out of it, and they all had a good laugh. Then the orderly came in. He glanced at their bright faces, and then started to take the sheets off the goalkeeper's bed. "So has our brave defender of the fatherland been unmasked as a malingerer?" said Fresser. "Say something," said Gurner. "We're men here. You can tell us if something's happened." "He's dead. Cardiac arrest." "That's what comes of too many patriotic speeches," said Gurner. "You shouldn't speak like that about a dead man," said Bach. "He wasn't just putting on an act, he was being sincere. No, comrades, it's not right." "Ah," said Gurner, "I wasn't so wrong after all. I thought the lieutenant would give us the party line. I knew at once he was a true ideologue." That night, Bach felt too comfortable to go to sleep. It was strange to think of his comrades in their bunker, to remember how he and Leonard had drunk coffee and smoked as they watched the sunset through the open door. Yesterday, as he got into the field ambulance, he had put his good arm around Leonard's shoulder. They had looked each other in the eye and burst out laughing. No, he'd certainly never have guessed he'd end up drinking with an SS officer in a Stalingrad bunker, or walking through ruins lit up by fires to visit a Russian woman. What had happened to him was extraordinary. He had hated Hitler for many years. When he had heard grey-haired professors shamelessly claiming that Faraday, Darwin, and Edison were nothing but crooks who had plagiarized the ideas of German scientists, when he had heard them declare Hitler to be the greatest scientist of all times and all nations, he had thought savagely, "What nonsense! But they'll be unmasked soon enough." And he had felt the same about those improbable novels about the happiness of ideologically spotless workers and peasants, about the great educational work carried out by the all-wise party. And as for the miserable poems printed in magazines, these had upset him most of all. As a schoolboy, he had written poetry himself. And now here he was, in Stalingrad, wanting to join the party. As a child, when he had been afraid his father would get the better of him in an argument, he'd put his hands over his ears and shouted, "No, no, I'm not going to listen." Well, now he had listened, and his world had been turned upside down. He still felt as disgusted as ever by the plays and films he saw. Perhaps the people would have to go without poetry for a few years, or even a decade. But it was quite possible to write the truth even now. And what greater truth could there be today than the truth of the German soul? And the masters of the Renaissance had been able to express the very loftiest of spiritual values in works commissioned by bishops and princes. Although Krapp was still asleep, he was evidently still fighting the same old battle. In a voice that could probably be heard on the street, he screamed, "Quick, a hand grenade!" Obviously wanting to crawl forward, he turned over awkwardly, yelled with pain, and then began to snore again. Bach felt differently, even about the extermination of the Jews. Previously, it had sent shivers down his spine. Even now, if he were in power himself, he would immediately put a stop to this genocide. Nevertheless, though he had several Jewish friends himself, he had to admit that there was such a thing as a German soul and a German character, which meant that there must also be a Jewish soul and a Jewish character. Marxism had failed. His mother and father had both been social democrats, and this failure had been hard for him to admit. It was as though Marx were a physicist who had based a theory of the structure of matter on centrifugal forces and had felt only contempt for the universal forces of gravitational attraction. He had defined the centrifugal forces between different classes and had succeeded more clearly than anyone in showing how they had operated throughout human history. But like many great theoreticians, he had overestimated the importance of the forces he had discovered. He had believed that these forces alone determined the development of a society and the course of history. He had not so much as glimpsed the powerful forces that hold a nation together in spite of class differences. His social physics, based on a contempt for the universal law of national attraction, was simply absurd. The state is not an effect, it is a cause. The law that determines the birth of a nation-state is something miraculous and wonderful. A state is a living unity. It alone has the power to express what is most precious, what is truly immortal in millions of people. A German character, a German heart, a German will, a German spirit of self-sacrifice. Bach lay there for a while with his eyes closed. He began counting sheep. 1 white, 1 black, 1 white, 1 black, 1 white, 1 black. The next morning, after breakfast, he wrote a letter to his mother. Knowing she wouldn't like what he was writing, he frowned and sighed, but it was important to tell her what he had now come to feel. He hadn't said anything during his last spell of leave, but she had noticed his irritability, his unwillingness to go on listening to the same old reminiscences about his father. She would consider him an apostate from the faith of his father. But that wasn't true. Apostasy was the very thing he was renouncing. Tired out by the morning routine, the patients were very quiet. During the night, a man with serious wounds had been installed in the goalkeeper's bed. He was still unconscious, and they didn't yet know what unit he was from. How could he tell his mother that the people of this new Germany were now closer to him than friends he had known since childhood? An orderly came in. "Lieutenant Bach?" "Yes," said Bach, covering the letter with the palm of his hand. "There's a Russian woman asking for you, Lieutenant." "Me?" said Bach in surprise. He realized it must be Zina, but how could she have found out where he was? She must have asked the driver of the field ambulance. He felt touched and delighted. She must have hitched a lift during the night, and then walked 7 or 8 kilometres. He imagined her pale face, her large eyes, her thin neck, the grey shawl she wore round her head. Meanwhile, the ward was in uproar. "Lieutenant Bach," said Gann, "I take my hat off to you. That's what I call successful work on the native population." Fresser waved his hands in the air, as though shaking off drops of water. "Call her in. The lieutenant's got a good wide bed. We can marry them right now." "Ah, women are like dogs," said Krapp. "They always follow their men." All of a sudden Bach felt indignant. What did she think she was doing? How could she come and visit him in hospital? German officers were forbidden to have relationships with Russian women. And what if there had been relatives of his working in the hospital, or friends of the Forsters? Even a German woman would hardly have come to visit him after such a trivial affair. The man, who had been seriously wounded, seemed to be laughing contemptuously in his sleep. "Tell the woman I'm unable to come out to see her," he said grimly. Not wanting to take part in the general hilarity, he picked up his pencil and read over what he had written so far. "The most extraordinary thing of all is that whereas for years I felt I was being suppressed by the state, I now understand that it alone can give expression to my soul. I don't wish for an easy destiny. If necessary, I'll break with my old friends. I realize that I'm turning to will never consider me one of them, those people. But I'm ready to suffer for the sake of what is most important in me." The merriment in the ward continued. "Shh," said Gerner. "Don't disturb him. He's writing to his fiancée." Bach began to laugh himself. There were moments when his suppressed laughter sounded like sobs. He realized he could just as easily be crying.